welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. It is wedding season, so I've got a number of wedding videos coming up for you. This is one of them. In another video, you'll see a 3D wedding cake using the sandwiching technique. And in this video, I'm actually making one of the sides of the wedding cakes that we'll then use in that video. I like this. Here's an example of it. And I like this particular wedding cake because it is a good demonstration of how I like to work. It incorporates a lot of different techniques, which I think add richness and texture to the cookie. So for instance, I think it's got 6 or 7 techniques. It starts by rubber stamping the flowers, and then we will airbrush and stencil a gold grid pattern on it. We will lay down wafer paper flowers, which give nice texture and relief to the cookie. We'll also paint and dust the flowers that we stamped in the background, and then we'll add some finish work in terms of dots and beads with royal icing. So lots of techniques here, and we're going to take it one by one, but we're going to end up with something like that. So first things first, you want to start with a nice large wedding cake cookie, and here's the cutter I use. This one comes from coppergifts.com, and I think it's about 4.5 to 5 inches at the base and about that tall, but I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description or on my website. And you want to start with it fully top coated and dried all the way through because we're rubber stamping on it in the first step. And if the icing's at all wet, you will crack the icing when you rubber stamp on it because we're applying a particular amount of pressure to it. Now I have a whole video on rubber stamping in my DVD series, so I'm going to just quickly touch on it here. To rubber stamp, I use the same food coloring I use in my royal icing, which is a liquid gel food coloring. And I'd like to distribute the coloring onto the stamp with an uninked foam pad. This had no coloring on it whatsoever. I just added the food coloring to it earlier, which is why it's brown. Different types of stamps will work. It's nice to work with food grade stamps. I'm working with self-adhesive ones that mount to an acrylic block, which is kind of nice because I can see through the block and I can position it with a grid very easily on the cookie. So what I'm going to do start by first is stamping on these flowers as sort of a background effect. I'm going to try to create a cascading pattern up from the bottom up to the top of the cake. I'm going to orient it like about so here, and then we'll do another one here, and then we'll move on up with some smaller stamps. So you'll notice I inked my pad, but I blotted off the excess ink, and you want to do that so that you don't over ink the pad and get a lot of food coloring on the stamp. With these clear stamps, it's a little hard to tell if it's fully inked. That's what I'm looking at right now. It's hard to see, but I'm pretty certain it is because this is a small stamp pad and I had a lot of food coloring on that pad. I'm working on a non-skid surface too, just to make sure that this cookie is less likely to move, because if the cookie moves or the stamp moves, then I'll end up with a blurred imprint. And I'm pressing all over the area of the stamp to make sure it makes contact, particularly in the low areas of the cookie where there might be a bend in the icing. There's a little bit of a warp to this cookie at a low area here, and I didn't make great contact with the stamp. So I'm coming in with a really fine paintbrush with a little bit of food coloring on it. I'm going to try to fill in some of the lines that I missed. It doesn't have to be perfect. Oops, got a little too much color there. So you can always kind of fix up a stamp if you've missed parts of it. Just do blot the tip of the brush before you apply. So here I got it a little too dark, I think. Okay, so now we're going to continue with stamping because I want to stamp all the way up the sides of the cookie. I'm going to re-ink the stamp. Position it about here. And press a little harder than I did last time. I've cracked a couple cookies this way, but not too many. I always make a few extra just in case. Yeah, that's a much better imprint. And I pushed a little bit harder, and that's why. Now I'm going to move on to some smaller stamps. These are all individual stamps to fill in the flowers up at the top and a few around the bottom. So I'm going to do one at a time here. And I've got a smaller acrylic mount. You want to size the mount to the stamp that you're using. I'm going to put him about here. Oops, I moved that, so this one might be a little bit smudged. I moved it even before it hit the cookie. So it's a little bit of a smudge there. And then I'm going to put 2 more flowers up at the top. I'm going to mount these 2 at the same time. You can mount multiple stamps on the same pad as long as they're the same height. If they're different heights, then one won't make contact. The one that's lower won't make contact with the cookie. So these happen to be the same height. cute. And I'm going to use the same stamp down here and put a few little flowers down there. I usually do re-ink the stamp with each application. The cool thing about these stamps is you can rotate them and create different patterns depending on the orientation of the stamp and how many you put on the block. Okay, good. I pressed a little harder so it's a little darker there. So that's stamping. Now the next thing that you want to do with this cookie is add the color to the stamps. And to do that, I actually painted them with a combination of food coloring extended with extract and petal dust. You can paint with different things. This is a painting technique. But we're going to start by painting with a little bit of food coloring. I'm going to put a little bit of yellow and pink on this. And I've just got a little, this is actually a fondant smoother. I use this kind of a paint palette. But you can use any kind of container. This one stains, though, as you can see from other use. And you could paint this coloring on straight up, but it'd be very, very dark. So I want to extend it with a little bit of extract. These food colorings are actually soluble in alcohol, not water. And alcohol also dries a little bit faster than water. You could thin with water, but it tends to sit on top of the cookie and it can etch through the icing. It can dissolve the icing. So I like to work with an alcohol-based extender when I can. Okay, so I'm going to have a little bit of paper towel near me so I can kind of test the color on it, the intensity of it, before I put it on the cookie. I don't want it too dark. I'll just show you a sample here. I've got one already painted so you can see what the finished results look like. Because painting this whole cookie could take me a little bit of time. I want to be pretty precise about the placement of the coloring. Before you start painting, typically I would let the brown food coloring that I stamped on dry pretty thoroughly, because any mixing of the alcohol in with the brown can cause that brown to smudge and the colors to become muddy. Sometimes that looks good. You know, I might get more of an orange color than a pink if I mix some of the brown in with it. But if you don't want that, make sure that food coloring, the brown, is completely dry. So with the right size brush, you can get very fine detail painted here. I think you get the idea. I'm going to just show you yellow. I'm going to take a clean brush for that. And we'll do the edges of this. We'll do the center in yellow here. We'll do the edges of this cookie in yellow. Again, I've got a pretty teeny brush here that allows me to get into these small spots with some accuracy. The cookie. Now, on these smaller stamps, where there's a lot of brown in the center of the stamp, there's invariably going to be a little bit of color mixing, blending of the yellow with the brown color, so they may end up looking a little more orange, but I think that these variations in color actually look quite good. I'm going to set that aside. I have one that I've pretty much painted already. So we're going to move on to laying the lattice work, which is a technique similar to airbrushing, except I'm not using an airbrush. I'm using a spray color. I'm going to leave some of my paintbrushes and things near here, but I'm clearing them out of the way so I don't spray them. Now, I want to lay this lattice work in those areas where there aren't flowers. And in order to do that, you know, I could spray the whole cookie, but then with a stencil, but I'd then have lattice work all over the cookie. So what I've done is I've taken a little bit of this press and seal. You can use normal plastic wrap. And if you'll notice, I've masked off the areas that I had stamped and painted earlier. I swapped in a cookie that is completely dry. Again, you don't want to mask off until the underlying paint and ink from the stamps are dry, because you'll smudge your pattern. So I've masked it all off here, and just to show you what I mean, I have one remaining piece to mask, that little flower at the top. And you want to make sure it's lying as flat as possible so that your stencil lies flat, because if your stencil doesn't lie flat, then it'll be really tough to airbrush or spray this, as the case may be. And you'll see that my stencil is lifting on either end, on some of these ends where the icing rolls down. So I'm going to be pressing down pretty hard on it towards the edges to make sure that it lies as flat as possible while I'm airbrushing. Before I start to airbrush, and I'm saying airbrushing, but I'm really spraying with a spray out of a can. I am going to lay some parchment down so I don't spray my whole work surface. And I've got this backdrop up to catch any overspray as well. Okay, so stencil's down. So I'm working with a PME spray, luster spray. This is just to give the cookie a little more detail. You want to shake it up before you use it. And now you can press down with your hand. You might want to glove your hand because you're going to spray your hand. sometimes I wear rubber gloves, or you can use something like a trussing needle to make sure that the stencil is lying flat in the areas you're spraying, and that keeps your hand out of the line of the spray. But I think I'm going to use the trussing needle actually, because I'm getting pretty good contact with it. And I try to go as directly top down as possible. And I'm going to move up to here and press down up in this area. Now I'm doing this side. I'm just moving my trussing needle as I go to make sure I'm making contact. I'll move that to the side. I got gold luster all over me. I'll pull that up. Now it may look like I've sprayed everywhere, but now what I'm going to do is pick up the masked plastic, and you'll see that it's just sprayed the areas surrounding the areas that I had masked. So that just creates a little bit of an accent to the sides of the cookie. And now, this is when I would come back in and kind of dust with the green or paint with the green to fill in, because there's some white voids all in here and it looks a little patchy. So to fill that in and connect the gold lattice a little bit better with the rest of the design, I'm going to take my moss green petal dust. I'm going to just start by dusting in and around the flowers. There's some flowers I left unpainted. You could have painted all of those, and I did on these sample cookies that I have. And if you dust on with a dry brush and dry petal dust, you get a very soft kind of green finish. If you want something more opaque, then you would extend it with the extract like we did the regular food coloring, and you'll get a much kind of darker look to the green. But I'm kind of liking this light. So I'm just going to fill in around there. Just kind of trying to close in some of these spots. And it's okay if you go over the flowers a little bit. And any excess dust I'll just shake off like so. And I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and paint in all the rest of the flowers just so that gives it more of a finished look. And when we're done with that, we'll come back and do the finished work, which is laying on the wafer papers and the icing detail. Okay, I'm back. I ended up going ahead and filling in color painting the way I'd shown you before, all the way up the sides. And now the next step is detail work with royal icing. And I've got icing of beadwork consistency, brown in here, which I'm going to use to lay sort of dividing lines between the tiers, as I have on this cookie here. And the icing consistency adjustments can be found on my website. And I'll have a link in the video description as well. I'm not going to cut through the flowers because I want it to appear as if the flowers are cascading over these borders. So I'm going to stop the border and then continue on the other side. So those borders are down. The other detail I have on here in terms of icing beadwork are these little pink dots in the middle of the gold lattice. And I kind of think those might look nice too. So I've got icing of the same consistency, just a different color in this bag here. Could be a little bit darker to show up a little bit better, I think. But we're going to go ahead and use it. I'm just adding little accents to all these little centers on the gold lattice. Slightly smaller dots than the brown dots, so I've got the bag less open. And I'm not pushing as hard. A combination of two things. Okay, and my next step is to put down wafer paper flowers and frosting leaves, just to give it a little bit of height and to create some depth to those bouquets, as if some flowers are layered on tops of others. So I'm going to go ahead and bring over some wafer paper flowers. These I'll be showing you how to make in a subsequent video. These are little florets that I think are perfectly sized to cookies. And I'm just going to pull a few out here. We have some color choices. We have more of this purple color and more of this orangey tone. I happen to think the orangey tone looks just a little bit better on these cookies, so we're going to work with that. I'm going to pull those out. And we've got some gold dragées to give them a little bit of highlight in the center in terms of some shimmer. Now to stick these on, we need a thick royal icing glue. And whenever I lay anything on that I want to dry quickly, I use a thick icing. This is white, and again, I'm using white rather than brown because I'm gluing directly onto a white cookie, I'm positioning a lot of the flowers right at these points where the dotted line breaks. So it looks again like they're flowers that are kind of breaking up the midpoint of the tier. I've also got these double florets that are pink, and I'm going to put a few of those on too. They're formed a slightly different way, and again, I'll be showing how to make those in my wafer paper flower video that's coming up shortly. And so here again, just putting a little bit of glue on the back of it and then sticking it onto the cookie. If you feel like it's not making great contact with the cookie, you can always take your trussing needle and finesse the position. I don't really love that floret because it's kind of smushed, so we're going to take a fuller one and put that down. I'm going to try to glue it right where I had it so I don't see that bit of white icing. Good, okay. Then on to dots. Rather dragé centers. You can use, these are a 4mm dragé. They're rather large. You can use smaller ones if you'd like. And again, I'm just sticking them into place with a little bit of thick royal icing. Now I'm going to just finish with some moss green leaves in and around the flowers. And that will also kind of tie in the little bit of moss green that we gave in the background of the cascade. To get that particular leaf texture, this is one of those rare occasions where I do use a pastry bag with a metal tip. And here I've got a tip number, what is this? I believe it's a 352 leaf tip and a very thick icing because you want it to hold its shape. So I'm just going to pipe a few leaves behind each of these. I'm going to rotate so I can make sure the leaf is tucked nicely underneath the flower. And I kind of point them in different directions just to fill in some of the holes. And that's it. A nice wedding cake cookie that will assemble in 3D in a subsequent video, but even this alone looks pretty as it incorporates a number of different techniques which give it a lot of richness and texture. We've got everything from stamping to painting to stenciling to the use of wafer paper flowers on it, which we'll talk about in the next video. Till then, live sweetly.